This is Chef Grissom, and we're going to be talking about nut-based confections. These include marzipan, gianduja, dragée, rocher, and then some of the challenges we face when we work with nuts in long-term storage. So nut-based confections can add a lot of really great texture to your products, especially things like marzipan we use in multiple avenues of pastry. Certainly we use it in cake decorating, but we'll be making it from scratch here. So marzipan is traditionally made from almonds. It may be almonds mixed with other things, but in order to be called a marzipan, it has to be almond based. So we can certainly make things like hazelnut marzipan, cashew marzipan, peanut marzipan, for example, but we can't call it just marzipan. So it's just assumed that it has almonds in it as its base. The French method, which is what we're going to be going over here, is the most commonly used technique to make marzipan, and we're going to be starting with very simple ingredients and finishing up with a finished product with our marzipan. You can make it with almond paste. You can purchase in almond paste and just add in sugar and glucose to make that same kind of almond clay. That's a little bit of a shortcut, but this is the method for making it from actual almonds. So the first thing we want to do is take whole almonds and blanch them in boiling water. That's going to soften them, and it's going to add a little bit of moisture. So marzipan, just like ganache, is an emulsion, and if we don't have enough moisture in it, the whole thing is going to break. Remember that nuts are very high in fat, and anything high in fat has a tendency to separate and break. So we want to blanch these nuts and add just that little bit of moisture to them, and it also softens these nuts quite a bit and it allows it to take in the sugar. If you're using whole natural almonds, you want to peel them at this point. So as soon as you blanch them, you can typically just squeeze them and the nut will come out of the coating, out of the peel. It's a very quick process, but you don't want to grind that peel up. They're too fibrous and it's going to make your marzipan very grainy. So we'll always peel those products. At that point, after we've blanched them, we put them in the Robot and we chop them up. We grind them up just slightly. Transfer them to a bowl at that point, but we want to increase the surface area of those nuts so it'll take in more sugar. After we've done that, we cook our sugars, glucose syrup, and water just as if we're making a non-crystalline confection. Again, typically we take it up to a soft ball stage. Remember, we have to have 80% dissolved solids, so soft ball is where that begins. If you want a firmer marzipan, you can certainly cook that sugar syrup up higher, but 240 degrees is appropriate for a marzipan. It keeps it nice and soft. So cook that sugar, glucose syrup, water. Remember to brush down the sides of your pot. We don't want any crystallization. And then pour that over the nuts. So just pour it over and let them absorb it. At that point, it takes about 15-20 minutes to cool completely, and while it's cooling, those nuts are absorbing the sugar syrup, and we don't want to crystallize them. So cool them on a marble slab, it goes a little faster, or you can just leave them right in the bowl. It just takes a little bit longer. After they've cooled, you're going to put them in your food processor, and you only want to fill your food processor about halfway full with this. So you may have to grind them in batches, but you're going to grind it until it is perfectly smooth. The graininess that nuts can leave behind is really not great for marzipan. You want to have it as smooth as humanly possible. So it'll start to look like a dough. You may have to go in and break it up a few times to keep grinding that product. At that point, we want to cool it completely. Remember, you're going to get some friction out of your Robot. Let it cool completely, and then it will be moldable or malleable. We can dip it in chocolate, we can roll it out as a flavor layer, and we can use it in all types of confections. So you want to make it in advance. You don't want to use it the same day you make it. It can hold on to a little bit of excess moisture. You want to allow that to fully absorb. One of my favorite ways to use it is just to chocolate coat it and just have a marzipan filled chocolate, but certainly it can be a layer of things as well. Alternately, you can model it. You can make modeled figures out of marzipan. That's very common in a lot of your European shops. But in this case, we're just going to be coating it in chocolate. So like I said earlier, you can make it from commercial almond paste. Sometimes you get a little bitterness out of that, but that is certainly a way to avoid that the grinding process. So remember, marzipan is an emulsion. It's a fat in water emulsion. So you've got to have that dispersed phase and continuous phase, just like we do with ganache. If it separates, it means there's not enough water. Okay, just like ganache, it means there's too much fat in that product. So if it separates, what we want to do is break it apart, add a little bit of shelf-stable liquid. So typically a spirit works really well. Even something like a port wine, something that's a fortified wine that has a higher alcohol content. Put it back in the Roboku and grind it, grind it, grind it, and it will restore that emulsion. The higher you cook it, obviously the more water you're taking out of it, the more likely it is to separate, and the more likely it is to be grainy and crystallize. Gianduja, some of you may have seen this before, some may not, but this is a nut mixture with tempered chocolate. So it's ground nuts and chocolate, absolutely delicious. It tastes a lot like Nutella. If we use hazelnuts, but we can use almonds. It's really a great product. So it will set pretty firm if your chocolate is tempered well, but obviously we're going to be making it in here. So the ratio, very, very simple, 1 to 1 to 1. So dark chocolate, nuts, confectioner sugar. If you're using milk or white chocolate, you increase that to 1.25 to 1 to 1. So there is no water in gianduja, so you can be a little flexible. You can make it firmer, you can make it softer, kind of depending what you want your finished product to be. But typically it's a 1 to 1 to 1 ratio for dark chocolate. We always want to toast the nuts before we grind them because it brings out the flavor. We're not going to be cooking them any further in here. So whichever nuts we choose, hazelnut is the most common for gianduja, but whatever nuts we choose, we want to grind them, or I'm sorry, toast them so you really bring that flavor out, and then grind them with about a quarter, 25% of the confectioner sugar until they are completely fluid. You're basically going to be making a nut butter at this point. So just like we can kind of cheat with our marzipan and use the pre-made almond paste, you can certainly cheat with a gianduja and use a natural almond butter, hazelnut butter, etc. Remember, Nutella is not a natural hazelnut butter. It's got quite a bit of sugar already in it, so you want to use something that is just naturally processed that's only nuts and sugar. So grind it until it is completely fluid. At that point, you want to cool it down a little bit. This is the part they don't say in here because you're going to be adding in tempered chocolate. So you add your melted chocolate and the remaining sugar and then process it just until it kind of gets together. So if your chocolate is not already tempered going in and you're holding it under 90 degrees at this point, you would have to temper that product again, which you would temper exactly like you would temper any other chocolate, pouring it out on the slab and agitating it to form the correct crystals, going through the heating and cooling motion, just like we would table temper chocolate. Remember that anytime you have a fat added to your chocolate, it's going to inhibit that cocoa butter crystalline structure, so it's going to take a long time to do this. So the best way to do it is to grind that nut paste, let it cool to below 90 degrees, and then put in your chocolate at 90 degrees, already tempered, and that's going to allow you to skip that phase, or that step. Dragé, now this just means dredged. So a lot of what we see out in the United States as a dragé is a little bit different than what this is going to cover. So if you go to a ballpark, a mall, a sporting event of some kind, there's typically the person there selling the nuts coated with the crystallized sugar on the outside. You can usually get pecans and almonds and sometimes cashews done this way. And they have a big cart with like a big pan in it, and it's just moving these nuts around and around and around with the sugar syrup that crystallizes around the outside of them. That's how we start a dragé. But then a traditional dragé is continued to melt or continued to cook until that sugar crystallization melts on the outside, and then we cool it down and dip them in chocolate. When we make them in class, we're only going to go through the first part of this, where we're going to be cooking the nuts and putting them in the syrup, allow that sugar or syrup to crystallize, and then caramelizing those crystals on the outside. So it's basically combining moist and dry cooking techniques with sugar. So the first thing we want to do is cook our sugar and water to the thread stage. That's going to allow for crystallization. So it's going to have a significant amount of water in them. At that point, we're going to add untoasted nuts because we're going to continue to cook these nuts over the heat. So if we add them in already toasted, they're going to burn and they're going to be bitter. So we always want to add untoasted nuts in there. Remove it from the heat and we stir, and that sugar syrup that starts out liquid is going to get very powdery. It's going to create small crystals that almost just look like a white sugar powder on the outside, and it's going to crystallize very quickly. At that point, we're going to put it back on the heat, constantly stir it, and it's basically going to dry caramelize that crystallized sugar that's on the outside of those nuts, and it's going to create a smooth, firm barrier on the outside. That's where we're going to stop. But traditionally, what we would do is we would pour it out onto a marble slab, separate them, cool them, and then cover them in chocolate. Okay, but we're not going to do the chocolate technique in class, but that is pretty common for dragées. Refrigerate them briefly to set the chocolate. Obviously, nuts will hold on to heat, so we want to make sure they are completely cool before we enrobe them. Remember that a lot of refrigerators are humid, and these are now coated in caramel. The caramel will become hygroscopic. It will pull that humidity, so we need to be very careful how we're refrigerating these, and we don't want to refrigerate them into a humid environment. Okay, so at that point we would cover them in chocolate and then repeat that 3 times by covering them in chocolate, refrigerating them, taking them out, covering in chocolate, and we're basically creating a panning machine here. So if we had a panning machine, we could certainly use this to create our dragées. Rochers, these are just nut clusters. These are very similar to what we've done the earlier part of the class where we made the coconut haystacks and the peanut clusters. We call them rochers here. We take toasted nuts bound with chocolate. That's really all it is. And we can add other low moisture ingredients. We can add coconut, we can add dehydrated marshmallows, we can add dried fruit to these if we want to. But very, very simple. We want to take these nuts, toast them, and then we can sprinkle them with a spirit or syrup just to give it a little bit of flavor. That's really the only reason for that. Allow them to cool, make sure that everything going in here is low moisture, warm it up just a little bit. You don't want it to untemper your chocolate, but you don't want it to go in there cold so it sets the chocolate too quickly. So a little bit at a time, work it into the chocolate, take it out like the little haystack, and create small mounds. In our next segment, we're going to talk about some challenges with working with nuts, and we'll be right back.